Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Raquel. Thanks for coming a little early, everybody.
Of course.
Oh, it is 1:45.
And just as a reminder, if you can, just for attendance purposes, if you could adjust your profile name, there's a couple names that I see that I just had questions about. If you want to just click the three little dots on the top right-hand side of your profile, then you can adjust your name. Oh, thank you. Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks, Bruce. Hi, welcome to everybody who's coming in. I think everybody's names, for the most part, are displaying properly for our attendance purposes. We just want to run a report for flex reporting that we have to do. But if anybody has something that's not your name on your profile, then just go ahead and change it with the three little dots on the top right-hand side of your profile box. We'll get started in another minute here. Welcome, everyone. I know there's a few more people that are joining us. Welcome, Dr. Scholes. My name is Sarah Bosler. I'm the co-lead for FLY, as you may know, and I'm here to introduce our speaker for our afternoon session, Mr. Lasana Hotep, who's going to share with us about our students need us, a student-ready approach toward education. So we are recording this session, so this will be available also after our session, but just for the sake of time, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Lasana.
Good afternoon. It's good to be back after you all had your other sessions and also lunch. This is going to be a little bit of a different experience. It's going to be more workshop format, so it's going to be breakout rooms, and you guys are going to be able to have conversations with one another as well as share out collectively, unlike the keynote format where it was just talking. So thank you, President Superintendent Dr. Schultz, for being with us. Thank you for everyone who is joining this session. One of the things that I think is imperative if we're really going to do the transformative work that we have desire to see, because we care about our students and we care about the communities that we serve, it's imperative to know what we're really up against. Right? I found that one of the challenges to being successful in some of our efforts is that sometimes we're not really sure what we're up against. And I'm very fortunate that I'll be able to come back and really deal with some of these issues at a more in-depth level in the future. But for now, for this session, we'll be able to address some things. And so to kind of get an idea of what we're really up against, and what I mean by is the context under which we're dealing with this work, we're going to watch a short clip together of Jeff Duncan Andrade. And after we watch this short clip of Jeff Duncan Andrade, I'm going to put you in breakout rooms and have you all have a conversation amongst each other about what we hear from Dr. Jeff Duncan Andrade. After we have that conversation, I'm going to pull you back out of breakout rooms and ask an individual who was in your room to kind of give a quick summary or share out of what you all processed based on what Jeff said. And then after we take what Jeff said and what we processed collectively, we will move forward. So here's Jeff Duncan Andrade kind of giving us a perspective on what we're really dealing with in terms of public education in the United States of America.
No system that is a true meritocracy can have such predictable results. This has to be by design. If you think about it, everyone knows that the schools that serve the nation's most vulnerable youth are the schools that are the least funded, the most dilapidated, have the least experienced teachers. Those who need the most get the least, and those who need the least get the most. This is a choice that we are making. And we are choosing to create systemic conditions where some kids succeed and some kids, and we know at the start of the school year with incredible accuracy who those kids are going to be, no matter how hard they work. And then achievement data comes out and everybody acts all shocked. You have to act shocked, because what's the alternative? To say, yeah, we pretty much knew that this was a rigged game. You can't say that and then at the same time uphold this rhetoric of we're a multiracial, pluralistic democracy. We're not. Okay? We're a quasi-caste system based on where you're born, your zip code, which family you're born in. These are incredibly accurate predictors of life outcomes. And you can't at the same time talk about a meritocracy and have, in effect, a loaded social lottery. And if you know the history of public schools in this country, then you know exactly what schools were designed to do. And you know that they are doing exactly what they are designed to do. And you know that they were designed to create this social hierarchy, okay, that is by design unequal, unfair, structurally unjust, that created an unequal distribution of resources and opportunity, and at the same time normed that in a society such that there wasn't massive social unrest. It was completely deliberate. We've created this massive, I mean, unimaginable gap between the haves and the so-called haves and the have-nots, right? In fact, that gap is larger than any other time in the history of the industrialized world. Why don't we have social unrest in the United States? We have the highest rate of incarceration in the history of the world, history of the industrialized world. We have the highest gap between the rich and the poor in the history of the industrialized world. And we have relative social calm. Steve Biko was a social activist in South Africa. He said that the greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. You cannot completely control a people with force. But if you can get in here, if you can create passivity in here, if you can create self-doubt in here, if you can interrupt hope and paralyze people. You see, this is why public education is both so powerful and such a powerful weapon. If you want to oppress people, you don't deny them school because they'll get educated and they'll rise up. Instead, you school them. You take their children for 13 years, right? And you create a system of passivity. You define for them what resistance is. You define for them what social change looks like. And it's all resistance and social change that you can control. And if you don't change the consciousness of a people, then everything that comes out of that school system is going to be socially reproductive. It's going to be a social mirror, and we're going to get back exactly what we put in. The foundation of public schools in this country is rotten. So all these investments that we're making will never have the impact that we want them to because the foundation is rotten. But if we go back to the foundation, okay, the fundamental question must be, what is the purpose of public schools in this nation state? And if the purpose of public schools continues to be to create individual pathways out of poverty, we will never end poverty. The point of education is not to escape poverty. The point of education is to end it. But we don't educate in this society. We school. And that is a fundamental difference. Okay? We have built a system of schooling. And schooling is the process by which you institutionalize people to accept their proper station in life. Education is the process by which you teach people that they can fundamentally change the society. We don't educate the majority of the people in this society. We school them.
So I wanted to start off with something very light and soft. As you can see, nothing too heavy. You know, we're going to ramp up to the more challenging stuff. I'm going to put you all in a few breakout rooms. If you're in a room with someone you know, acknowledge it. If you're in a room with someone that you happen to despise and not get along with, or, you got rap beef with from school, I had nothing to do with the assignment of the rooms. It's random. I didn't pick them. So if you're in a room with friends, great. If you're in a room with enemies, I expect you to be professional. And so what I want you to do is just have a conversation with you all, who's ever in your group, about what we watched in this video. And then I'll ask someone from the group to kind of share out and summarize. I won't be able to do individual introductions in the main room because it's such a wonderful large group that it would take up the vast majority of the time. But what I would like is whoever shares out to introduce themselves and then kind of share out the summary of their conversation. So you're going to receive an invitation to your room, and there you go. I'll see you shortly. If you didn't receive an invitation to a breakout room, please just let me know. Hey, we're in breakout rooms. I'm going to go ahead and assign you to a breakout room and you can just join. Thank you. Everyone's in breakout rooms right now. For those who are just joining us, they'll be back in about 3 minutes. I'm going to keep you in the main room for now. For those who are just joining us, everyone's in breakout rooms. They'll be back in about a minute or so. Welcome back. Welcome back. Here we go. I saw that some folks requested the link to the video, and then also there are some who are just joining us. So I just put the video link in the chat. So those who are just joining us after we had already went to breakout rooms have an idea what we're talking about, and then those who just kind of want to have access to the link at some point to razzle dazzle their colleagues, you have it available. So I'm gonna see, we had 6 rooms. I don't know if we're gonna be able to make it to all 6 rooms, so I'm gonna kind of ask for a volunteer. Is there anyone who want to volunteer on a summary of what your group discussed based on the video? Anyone, just unmute yourself.
Sure.
Got a brave soul. Please share.
I'm just used to having my mouth open, so don't give me credit for bravery. I think our group touched on a bunch of different points that is a challenge we run into when we're trying to shift realities for ourselves and for students. And so the first is, as we start to talk about what could be called oppression, indoctrination, homologous reproduction, that we initially push back against those descriptions because we think it is defining our own praxis, right? That's not me. And so fair enough, even if that isn't you, that reality exists. So you can be someone toiling productively inside of a system that is not structured for that greatness that you're trying to inspire to ever lift off. So like, it's just like taking a second to take your ego out of it, or take the idea that you've done something wrong, so you can look at the problem without having to basically filter through your ego.
Mhm.
So there's the one piece. And then we started talking about all the different ways in which people might be made to feel lesser inside of an institution. Like if you go to an educational institution where the title's slightly different, if you go to continuation school, if you go to night school, like when the name changes, community college versus UC inside of our system, there's some implied ideas around rigor and value and intellect that sort of tie up our ability to sort of think about productively what we're offering versus what message we're trying to control, right? The external messaging sort of gets in the way of us internally making those changes that are authentic to us versus looking good.
Absolutely.
And then lastly, we, as a group, we started talking about, well, the scaffolding that happens inside the system based on money, and how we all came to this system wanting to create really powerful and interesting change for students. But when we look at the system, we are paid a quarter per student, full-time student equivalent, as compared to the UC. So that scaffolding is telling you, Paul made a comment as we're going to breakout rooms about how the system wants an uneducated society. And when you look at those numbers, it's like the system seems to have scaffolded out. We all want everyone to know math because we want our drive-through change to be correct. And maybe that's, and one of my colleagues was like, oh, that's really harsh. And I'm like, okay, well, let's be really harsh for a second and just play that out. What does that look like? So we can have everything on the table to have that conversation versus trying to make it palatable when the things we're talking about are unspeakable.
Absolutely. Thank you. Is it Nikawana Sims?
Shaw.
I mean, Nikawana Shaw. My apologies.
Yeah.
Nikawana.
No, it's all right. You got the first name right, buddy.
Thank you, Nikawana, for speaking to the piece about the theme about ego, also the getting your ego out of it, and also the theme about titles and the naming of institutions kind of give a degree of within a particular hierarchy in education. And then, of course, lastly, this whole notion of resourcing, and that sends a message very clearly. So thank you very much for that summary. I'll take a couple more. Who else was in a group other than Nikawanas who want to kind of give a quick summary? Just unmute yourself. All right. I think Dana Hester.
Hi, we were in group 4 and we had a couple of themes that we discussed. One was the difficulty or challenge that can be from the very top with how a particular administration might be supportive of schooling as opposed to education, not wanting people to be educated. Some administrations more than others. And then also from an educational standpoint, the difficulty, especially at our level, of encountering somewhat more fully formed adults. And if the students' family background, for instance, was at cross purposes with what we're trying to impart, that's a significant hurdle to overcome, and that's a big challenge for faculty.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Dana. And one more group who has a summary. Anyone else?
Address the class structure and how it's embedded in education in the past, whether it's, teaching people to be coal miners or teaching people to be factory workers or teaching people to be on the farm. And then some communities with less additional resources just teach very basic skills. One of the participants said he teaches in the K through 12 and everybody thinks all they can do is be a medical technician and they don't think about anything else. Whereas the elites with all kinds of money and advantages, have a chance to dream for something more, or even something like the SATs. Even if you get rid of the SATs, people still don't have coaches to get into college, or they don't have someone to rewrite their application letters. And so there's still this inequity built into the system.
Thank you very much. Is that D. Overly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes.
I appreciate everyone sharing out and all of those insights from the individuals who are representing the groups. And Dr. Jeff Duncan Andrade is getting to this point about it being rigged, right? And it's very challenging for us to kind of wrap our minds around that. The kind of example sometimes I use in my work is, imagine you go off for a 3-day outing to one of the casinos out in Lake Tahoe or somewhere, right? And you go out to the blackjack table, and you're just on fire. You're just winning, and you came there and you said, I'm not going to play any more than $200, and you've been playing all night Friday night, and you're at $2,500 off of your $200 investment. And you're like, wow, this is great. So then you say, I'm gonna go back tomorrow. So Saturday you go back, you turn that $2,500 into $10,000, right? And then Saturday night comes and you're at the table and someone pulls you to the side and say, hey, what we found out is that this particular dealer has been cheating, right? And it's on the take, and you actually have been winning as a result of that cheating. But we're not going to hold any penalty on you because you didn't know, and we found out you weren't on the inside. But we just want to let you know we addressed it. And then you start playing that same game, and you're not winning as much, and you're losing a lot. You're going to feel a little bit different about it being rigged because you were winning when it was rigged. You liked when it was rigged. And then now that it's unrigged and everybody's on a level playing ground, you're very uncomfortable, and you actually feel cheated now. You feel cheated at the level playing field because you are benefiting from the rigged, right? And this is what we have in our society, right? And this is what Jeff is trying to lay out. And so this feeling and these sentiments that we have connected to this conversation around equity and social justice, and especially where it intersects with education, is that's squarely what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a system that has historically been rigged, right? Initially, America, when it became a nation state, prior to becoming a nation state, all the way until 1865 was a slaveocracy. From 1865 till 1965, Civil Rights Amendment and Voting Rights Act, we were an apartheid system. And then we've tried this quasi-pluralistic democracy from 1965 until now, right? And every step of the way, every time we've tried to level the playing field, to unrig it, it has been pure war, pure opposition. Anytime somebody tried to level the playing field, say, we no longer want a rigged blackjack game, it has been attack after attack after attack after attack. Never unmolested, never just like, well, let's see how fairness plays out. Nope. Lawsuit. Oh, you let people in because they're black. We can't have you doing that. Well, you were letting people in because they were white for 200 years. You let 5 people in school because they're black. Oh my God, the system has to come down, right? So this is what we have to deal with. And so the reason why I titled this section called Our Students Need Us is because as I made my way through a significant amount of the California community colleges, I see similar themes, right? And I see this centering, not of the student suffering, but the centering of the perceived suffering by those of us who have found ways to not necessarily benefit from other suffering, but benefit from the structures. And so what happens is we come having these structural conversations instead of a conversation around what we really need to be doing for our students, because our students need us. But then I go to campuses that I'm a consultant at, and I try to talk about the students, and then I end up having this conversation. What the contract will or won't let me do. Who's going to get the stipends? How much reassigned time am I going to get? It compromises rigor. This is the conversations, classroom size. And I'm not saying any of these things are not real issues. I think they are real issues. But I think that we need to reverse how we're doing it. I think we start with what needs to be done to support the people who have traditionally been disproportionately impacted by our qualitative and quantitative data. And then we look at these particular things, right? And then we figure out how are they in alignment or not in alignment. And we need to separate the conversation about student success from the labor conversation. I think the labor conversation is a legitimate conversation. It has credence, it has value. But when they get conflated, student success is always going to lose. Student success is always going to lose. It's always going to play the back. And so we have to understand that our students need us to be able to work through this, to figure it out to where we have a just and equitable labor experience, but not at the expense of student success and vice versa. But our students need us. That's where the conversation starts. Then we begin to figure out what does it take for the students to need us, and then we figure out the labor arrangement that needs to take that place. But it cannot be every time somebody brings up things that leads to the student success agenda, we show how our particular organization is not set up for that. So then it just totally neutralizes what we're trying to do for student success. Oh, we can't do this because that says this. We can't do this because that says that. Well, that means it. And now all of a sudden, now we have an entire educational structure that doesn't lead to student success, but it does secure particular labor experiences. And so what we have to do to be able to be successful in this work is to really, 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 really get to our particular locus of control. Because we all know what everybody else needs to do. We know what the legislature needs to do. We know what the district needs to do. We know what Eloy needs to do. We know what Dr. Schultz needs to do. We know what everybody needs to do. And that's fine. We know what the students need to do. We know what their families need to do. But once they step onto our campuses, physically or virtually, we have some type of autonomy. And what I'm finding is that when we want to have control or autonomy, we really exert agency. But when it comes to equity, somehow we lose that. So like when we're at the bargaining table, we have a lot of agency. When we're talking about academic freedom, we have a lot of agency. When we talk about 10+1, a lot of agency. As soon as we bring up equity, oh, well, the dean, the president, so I need to know, do we really have all of this agency that we bring in certain settings or we don't? And so I really need for us to own this because our students need us. This is not coming from a Lasana Hotep perspective. This is me engaging tens of thousands of students over the years and watching us as administrators, faculty, and classified professionals get into these particular tiffs and rifts, and not saying that they're petty, right? But they totally eclipse that our students need us. And so when we think about this and we understand that we do have influence and that we may not be in control of every single thing, but we're in control of something, we have to come to terms with this. And in this piece that was done in the Chronicle of Higher Education, this entire report on diversifying your particular college, diversifying your campus, they had a quote that says, efforts to increase racial diversity are often treated as add-ons instead of addressing the structural barriers that hamper the progress of people of color, right? And it's really this irony. The opportunities that are established to address the marginalized population are marginalized themselves. They're kept on the margins. They're not braided within the fabric of the institution. And everybody within the institution have a rationale on why they don't need it, right? Why it's someone else. I remember when I went to a particular institution and I went and met with the head of professional development and said, hey, how can we partner? And they told me, we don't need all that equity stuff. Somebody else needs it over here, right? Just flat out, that's great. That's cool, Lasana, you're a nice guy. We don't need that here. That needs to be done over there. And we have all of these different pockets within the institution that feel like they don't need it. And then you have this other sentiment that's very common. And Tabby Chavez, she talks about it in this way. She says, most people are on principle favorable about the idea of racial diversity, as long as we don't have to change anything about the way we do the way we do things in our daily lives. And this is what I found to be true, is that on principle, in theory, in conversation, even in programs and even trainings, we're there. But again, it's as long as I don't have to change anything. And we have to deal with this work from, again, like I showed you that picture, that before and after on the HGTV. What is it that's gonna be my before and after? If I'm doing the exact same thing as I was doing before, how are we gonna get any different outcomes? This is another sentiment that's common. What if we don't change it? What if we don't change at all and something just magical happens? And this is what's happening in a lot of our institutions. And so we have to have a reimagination of our role within the institutions and what can we do to enact a student success agenda that has the impact on the students collectively, but especially the institution, that we become the destinations of choice because the students know that the way in which we structured ourselves, the way in which we engage in teaching and learning, in the way that we make ourselves and avail ourselves and make ourselves available, that the students know that they can come and meet their professional and personal and academic goals. So the first thing we have to do, if we're really going to do this transformative work, is we have to address this notion that is hanging at the center of a lot of our institutions. We are centering the comfort of our colleagues over the suffering of our students. And I can tell by the types of responses I get when I engage in this work, where some of the responses are about what's wrong with the students and the communities they come from, and what's wrong with this particular administrative arm, or things like, well, if we do this, we're going to compromise rigor. It's kind of like my friends who have restrictive diets, right? So I have friends that are either vegan or vegetarian. As soon as someone tells somebody they're vegan or vegetarian, for some reason, everybody is a nutritionist. They just turn to, how do you get your protein, right? I'm sure you're familiar with this. Right? Nobody asks you about your damn protein or your health. They can see you guzzling beers all day Sunday. They can see you drinking wine on. They never ask you about, has your doctor, or they don't ask you nothing of that. But as soon as you say you're a vegetarian or vegan, how do you get your protein? Now everybody's a nutritionist. And that's the same thing with this equity work. Now all the people want to start talking about rigor. Nobody brings up rigor before. Doesn't come up. Now as soon as you say, well, we want to do, well, it's going to compromise rigor. Right? We come up with all these different responses. Right? See somebody smoking cigarettes. Nobody says, well, does your doctor approve of you smoking cigarettes? No, no one says that. We don't, any other behaviors, we do not have the same lens. But as soon as there's something that's going to challenge the status quo, as soon as something that might shift for the communities that we're here to serve, now all of a sudden has this deep inquiry, and we're all pedagogues, and we're all baby Paulo Freire's. Right? Just like we all become nutritionists as soon as somebody tells you they're vegan. And you ask nobody else about their protein. And so there is rigor at the center of this work. People who do whatever you call it, whether you call it culturally responsive teaching, culturally sustaining teaching, culturally relevant pedagogy, it is rigor at the center. The creators of it has centered rigor. One of the founding pedagogues who created culturally responsive teaching, Zarita Hammond, she says it. When trying to help students improve their learning using culturally responsive practice, this approach offers a systemic, collective process so teachers build shared language and shared understanding of what works. Too often, teachers think the magic is in the strategy and do not focus on helping the student become a more confident, independent learner. Right? So when we start talking about this kind of work, and we start looking at this thing like rigor, the traditional rigor is to let's make things more difficult. That means it's rigorous, right? Let's give them assignments that take a long time. That's rigorous. Let's meet some kind of adherence to some kind of standards, Common Core type thing that's really just, that's rigor. And all those things will be compromised if we go this equity route, or we go this culturally relevant route, or culturally sustaining, or whatever type of way we approach it. So we hang our hats on these things. And it kind of reminds me of when this conversation about rigor came up, I started thinking about what I know historically about post-secondary institutions, right? And so one of the most brilliant minds ever created, or at least we had privilege to or access to through academia in the United States of America, is a guy named W.B. Du Bois, right? And he's a sociologist, a historian, a political scientist, and so many other things. And you think about Du Bois and his trajectory, right? Growing up in Massachusetts and being the first Black person from Harvard to get a PhD, and his teaching career, his work as an activist, and all those other kind of things. And so I really have read multiple, he has several biographies. I read several of them. I read a lot of profiles. I watched a lot of documentaries. And I was like, man, these people really had to be smart back then just to get a bachelor's degree. Back then, for us to have, those of us who just have bachelor's, we're not even talking about advanced degrees yet. We had to know Latin and Greek and all these other languages. And I look at all my colleagues and I'm like, we hardly holding on to English. Is your bachelor's less valuable? Has our rigor been compromised because we can't read Latin? That we can't read Greek? Right? Because they had to learn those languages because those were the foundational languages in the texts that they were deriving the stuff from, right? When they were studying Greek philosophers, they read it in Greek. right? When they were studying the Latin foundations, they were reading them in Latin, right? We don't do that now, but we still have our degrees and our titles. Those of you who have doctorates, you're still Dr. So-and-so and so-and-so, even though you can't read Latin and Greek. But for Du Bois to be a doctor, he had to read Latin and Greek, and he spoke German. That's why he went to graduate school in Germany. So I did the research. I said, when did they stop making us having to learn Latin? And it started, I think, in 1922 with Yale. And once Yale said you no longer have to have Latin to get a degree, then all the other institutions followed. I think that probably would have led to the downfall of academia, right? As soon as they got rid of Latin. That's why we all are terrible academics, because of the rigor. They compromised the rigor. We should know Latin. No, they realized that it wasn't necessary for what we need to do. A lot of times we're tethered to these things as they're like some kind of holy grail, and that we're compromising something sacred. Not really because it's sacred, it's because we want to maintain the status quo. Because what really rigor looks like in a transformative society, in our work as academics, whether we're in the classroom or out of classroom, what we're doing is what? We create challenges that help students meet the high expectations. So we still challenge them, right? But we challenge them in a way of, this is where the threshold is. This is where you have to be. And we're going to give you challenges that are going to help you meet that threshold. Not just harder, longer assignments, but they're connected to meeting that threshold. They engage the student in critical thinking that at deep levels. But most importantly, what you'll see as a theme through all of this work is that it connects what's going on in the classroom and the assignments beyond the classroom setting. How does this connect to the real world that you live in on a consistent basis? That does not compromise rigor. That does not put a person in a situation where they're less informed or they're less intellectually astute. Being able to connect these themes that we're talking about in our courses to what's going on in our lives. You notice that you got a whole bunch of students who show up on skateboards in your class. You can connect skateboards to physics. I know you can. But to totally ignore all the skateboarding and to talk about these abstract concepts and then blame the student because you're in the abstract realm, instead of starting with the concrete and going to the abstract, we start with the abstract and then maybe sometimes bring it to the concrete. This is what transformative rigor looks like. It's still rigorous. We have to interrogate our practices. We are still in the right to fail mode. Our practices, our pedagogy, our techniques represent that. The things that we talk about and that we center represent that. And so if we want to look at what does it look like? What does an experience seems like in this transformative space? I'm going to show you an example. This is a clip of Dr. Paul Hernandez. Dr. Paul Hernandez had left school early, around the 9th, 10th grade. He felt that he wasn't going to be successful at school, and he got involved in community, what they call gangs, but these youth community organizations. And at a certain point, he's like, this life is not the life I want to live. I want to re-engage in academics. And so what he did was he left the streets and he went to community college. And this is what happened.
Worked against me. Eventually, when I made it to community college, I was lost, confused, and frustrated. But fortunately, like Ms. Gates, I encountered a few professors who unknowingly used real talk with me. And they helped me overcome the obstacles I faced and develop a sense of belonging in college. One of those professors was Professor Garcia. He was amazing. He kept us at the edge of our seat for every class. He was an older professor, full of energy. And I remember the first 2 weeks of sitting in his class, I stared at him intensely. I was trying to memorize every single thing he said. Well, about 2 weeks into the class, there was a group of students sitting next to me, and they were talking about sharing and exchanging their notes in order to better prepare for the test. Well, at that point, it dawned on me. I thought to myself, maybe I should write something down. I spent the next 2 weeks, no lie, writing down every single thing he said, from the crazy stories about his crazy cat to the arguments with his wife. I wrote it all down. I left that class with such a bad cramp in my hand. Then the day of the test came. I had never prepared for something so much like I did for that test. When he handed it out, I looked at it from front to back, and I was genuinely shocked when I didn't see a single question about his cat or an argument with his wife. But you know what? I gave it my all. Handed it in, I left, came back the following week. When he gave me my test back, my very best couldn't even get me a passing grade. I was humiliated. I wanted to run away and not be seen. Well, he noticed. And he asked me to stay after class, and I did. And he walked up to me and he said, "Paul, is everything okay?" I said, "Yes, sir. I just want to do well in your class." He said, "Yeah, about that. The first 2 weeks of class, you just kind of stared at me. I thought you were bored out of your mind." I said, "No, sir. I just want to do well in your class." Then he said, "Yeah, but then the next couple of weeks, you wrote down every single thing I said. I felt terrible. I wanted to cut lecture in half." I said, "No, sir. I just want to do well in your class." As he looked into my eyes and I looked into his, I knew that he knew that I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. So then he said, without pressuring or embarrassing me, he said, "You know, I really struggled when I was a student, and I still struggle as a professional. Come to my office. I'll show you how I take notes. You can show me how you take notes, and we can learn from each other. Because remember, everyone takes notes in whatever way works best for them." That day was the first time in my life that someone had taught me how to take notes. Something so simple to him, yet so incredibly powerful for me. A skill I kept the rest of my life.
So Dr. Hernandez shares his testimony about his experience with Professor Garcia. I was going to break you all out in breakout rooms, but I'm just going to have you all share freely in the main room. So give me some feedback. What are your initial feedback based on Dr. Hernandez's experience? Thoughts, feelings, sentiments in the context of what we're talking about, compromising rigor and being transformative and reimagining our work. You can raise your hand or you can unmute. Nikawana.
Dang it
You
again. I
have the
feel like I'm
floor.
winning bingo. I think something really powerful there for me is there are possibly missed opportunities or assumed competencies as we're working with students. So, and I think the same is true for us as colleagues, right? We get the opening semester email assuming that we all know how to do the thing and that we know how to do the new thing every time. And I think that assumption of competency bleeds over into the student knows how to do the thing because I sent the email with the stuff. So the thing and the stuff is completely known because the email got received. It feels a bit like the Princess Bride, right? Like the thing of the thing happened and magic mechs. And so there's some sort of alchemy that's supposed to happen where the email sparks synapses to learn the thing, right? I told them so they should know. And I think that doesn't just happen with us who are students, but between each other inside the organization. These are incredibly complex spaces. And so I might create a unit for a student to learn how to note take, but have I ever just asked them explicitly, like, how many of you looked at that? Does it make sense to you? Right? So I could be doing all the right things, but there's still the people piece that's missing, which is someone saying, hey, did you look at that thing? It's really important. Or is it not working for you? Is there something else that you'd like that could, unpack it differently? I think we can be doing all the right things. And if we don't actually do the people part of it, it can still fail, is what I got from that video.
The people part. Thank you very much. I see Laura hand raised.
Well, he reminds me of me because that was me, like lost. What do I do? And the incredible thing is when an instructor checks for understanding, and also the whole thing of humbling himself to my level, to the level of, okay, let's compare notes, how are you taking notes? Let me show you how I take notes. And it overcomes the barrier of fear, because that's the feeling, is fear. Like, oh my God, what is the instructor going to think about me? Or what are the students around me going to think about me? But the fact that that the doctor just came up and just said, hey, are you doing okay? I saw you take all kinds of notes. But that's just like a gift from that instructor. Took you on the wing, under the wing, and humbled himself, and showed that caring love. I when I would take my mom to the hospital for her health care, there was something that they put on a board, and it said, the most useful asset of a person is not a head full of knowledge, but a heart full of love, with ears open to listen and hands willing to help. And that's I go by that motto. It's really important to humble yourself, and not always get to the point of showing that you're elite, you're intelligent, because it's getting to the level of a person, especially our students, where they need that humbleness. And I think that that's a key way of breaking the barrier. So I love that video. Thank you for
Thank
sharing.
you, Lada. Humility. Thank you. Anyone else before we move forward? Yes, Gwen.
I was just thinking, going back to the video this morning, where you have 3 people doing the same actions and being treated very differently. There's a little bit of that sense that, oh, if we're all in the same classroom, we're all experiencing the same thing. And so as an instructor, you're going, what Nikwana was saying, it's hard to center yourself in the student's perspective, because you don't know exactly what they're experiencing, even though you feel like it's a shared experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So I love that the place of this, because we're on the same classroom, we're having the same experience. And that really speaks a lot, right? To when I talked about disproportion, you can have equality, but everybody's not having the same experience. But one thing about that particular clip, and there's so many things, and I go through that, with many groups, is everything that professor didn't compromise rigor. It didn't cause grade inflation, which we argue it's going to cause grade inflation. Right? Didn't give him the answers to the test. Right? He didn't say, I want to give you the answers to the test. He recognized where the student's challenge was and found a way to support. Right? He could have either did it himself like he did, or he could have got him the support services. But none of this work compromises rigor. None of this work causes grade inflation. None of this work keeps the student from learning. We have to get rid of these assumptions, these arguments that constantly keep coming up in our midst when we talk about doing this work this kind of way. And then we have to interrogate our assumptions. In order to do this work, in order for us to be successful as individual educators, but collectively as a community, it's going to take some critical self-reflection. It's going to take critical self-reflection. And that goes back to what Jeff Duncan Andrade was saying, is that what is our consciousness? And our colleague Dorinda Carter-Andrews speaks to this whole thing, what she calls the consciousness gap, and the role of critical self-reflection in us getting this work done.
Try to do in my work with educators is engage them in a process of critical self-reflection, because I believe this gap in consciousness about these issues is one of the equity imperatives of our time. And it's through helping educators think through these difficult topics that we'll be able to better meet the needs of our most struggling students in society. In order to do this, though, we've got to move away from those diversity workshops that happen 1 or 2 times a year for teachers and school leaders. This has to be a process of embedded, continual critical self-reflection throughout the professional work of educators, and really all of us. In this work that I do with educators, I ask them to consider 3 questions. The first one is, how does my own social location, my race, my class, my gender, my religion shape my mindset about teaching and learning, the students that I'm serving, and the practices that I act out? And secondly, What is it more that I need to know about what I don't know around those things related to culture, power, and difference? Where can I learn that material? And thirdly, this process helps educators to then continually be thinking about how can I be a more critically conscious leader and instructor. And in our country where we have such gross racial inequities in education, along with socioeconomic inequities, I think teachers and school leaders have to be thinking about how can I be a more critically race conscious educator? Now, there are a lot of things that I could say about critical race conscious.
Yes, it is, because Dorinda Carter Andrews is brilliant, and there's a lot of things she can say. But we're going to go back to the 3 things that she posed to us. This is how we get started on this pathway. We ask ourselves these 3 questions, and this leads to us in our path of discovery, right? How does my own social location, race, class, gender, religion shape my mindset about the practices that I act out? 2, what more is it that I need to know about culture, power, and difference? Where do I learn this information? How can I be a more critically conscious leader, right? These 3 questions sets us on a pathway and on a journey that unfolds, right, in the types of professional learning experiences that we engage in, the types of workshops that we select to go through when we're at our various professional conferences, the types of articles that we read in our trade journals about whatever our particular area or discipline is. It guides us, right? These questions serve as a guiding starting points to set us off on the journey. There are no tricks, there's no tips, there's no 1, 2 things that you do. There's no checklist of you do these 6 things. It's really about this journey of rediscovering yourself through critical self-reflection. And so, as I alluded to earlier, this desire to have equitable outcomes without disrupting the status quo is a virtual impossibility. And so I like to always remind my colleagues that you cannot be equity advancing and risk averse, right? Most of the questions I get after my presentations are in this spirit. They're like, how can I get all the benefits of doing this work without taking any risk, right? It's risky, right? Being equity advancing is risky because it's disrupting the status quo. And we stay with the status quo because at least we know what we're going to get with that, either individually or from our colleagues or from the institution as a whole. So we stay with what we know, especially during crises, right? That's what people do. They may start off on something, but then as soon as a crisis hit, you go back to what's familiar. But we know that the familiar produces disproportionate impact. So we have to be risk averse. Being risk averse doesn't mean that you just are on reckless abandon. But it does mean that when you're sitting down and you're plotting and you're planning and you're strategizing, right? That you may do this in phases. And you say, our institution is ready for this at this phase, but then we'll be ready for this phase. But there's no question, are we on this journey? We are no longer at the point of conversations are we on the journey or not. We're no longer at conversations on who's on board, who's not on board. We are going down this pathway. This is going to happen. We're going to reimagine counseling. We're going to reimagine how we do A&R and financial aid. We're going to reimagine how, as a unit and as a division, we engage in this particular type of work in terms of STEM or whatever. We're going to reimagine our recruitment and marketing. It's going to happen. Now, how we all are involved, how we all are engaged, that's what we have to determine, but we're moving in this direction. And yes, there's going to be stumbles and there's going to be bumps. We're not going to get it right all the time. But what's anchoring us is this particular process of discovery. And also, we already know the outcomes that we don't want from the status quo. Because we know that in this COVID moment that we're in, the groups who were marginalized and disproportionately impacted before COVID are now even more so, right? We have the anecdotal and the qualitative data to prove that. We have it within our enrollment numbers. If you disaggregate the enrollment numbers, you see who's no longer engaging our institutions. And so this is not a hypothetical. Our students need us. And they need us to ask different types of questions of ourselves. They need to ask different type of questions of each other. We can't keep having this circular conversation. There has to be a sense of urgency. I had a conversation with some folks I was consulting with the other day, and they were trying to grapple with this. And I said, well, let me ask you this. Let's say if you're not a parent, that you had a niece or nephew, and if you are a parent, your son or daughter was experiencing something at the school, and you knew specifically this particular situation was not your child's fault, was not your niece, nephew, or child's fault. It was really something that had to do with the institution. And you went to the leadership of the institution and said, hey, what are y'all doing to resolve this problem? And they say, well, we're working on getting buy-in from some key stakeholders. And then you went back a couple of weeks later. You said, hey, this is really a problem. I said, well, what we found is that what we need to do is create a task force. And every time you came back, it was some type of what they perceived activity, but to the people who suffering, it was very benign, right? It wasn't relieving their suffering, but they had task force. They were getting buy-in from stakeholders. They were doing these and all these other peripheral things, but anything but addressing the suffering, right? And I had to give that analogy so that we can have that personalized connection, so that we can be in the moment of now. But you can always put off stuff when you're not the person or the group that's suffering. Task force, you feel like you're doing something when you're on task force when you're not suffering. But let you be in a situation where you're suffering, somebody tell you they're trying to get buy-in from stakeholders. Try to take something back to a store and you ask, hey, I want to get my refund. They say, well, we're trying to get some buy-in from some stakeholders before we can give you a refund. All of us will be Karens. I don't care who you are. You're gonna end up on YouTube, right? So think about that sense of urgency. And lastly, before I open it up for conversation, one of my mentors was kind of trying to give me an understanding of how we move in our work, regardless of the work that we do, in the spaces that we enter, and how do we create change. And the analogy he uses, he said, when you go into a space, you can either be the thermostat or you can be the thermometer. You either can set the temperature or you can reflect the temperature. And that always stuck with me. And I think about this work that we're doing, this transformative work that we're doing in our schools. And there's a lot of us who intend in our hearts and minds to be the thermostat, to set the temperature. But we're being held back by those who want to just reflect the temperature of what's going on. And I'm calling on those thermostats to take charge, to be collegial, to continue to work and solicit as much feedback as you can from stakeholders, but do not let stakeholders control the direction. We're going in this direction because our students are suffering and we cannot task force and stakeholder our way out of this. We have to take action. And I told you earlier when I showed you the equity slide, the action is reallocating human resources, fiscal resources, and intellectual resources to those groups that are most disproportionately impacted. That's how you get to it. And it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be non-conventional. It's going to shake the foundation of the institution and those who are benefiting from the status quo. And if we don't do that, we will maintain the status quo and continue to get the suffering that we've had. So with that being said, I call on you to challenge yourself to be the thermostat and not the thermometer. Thank you very much. And I open the floor for questions and conversation.
If anyone has questions, they can add it to the chat, or if you want to raise your hand or unmute, feel free.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to thank you so very much for this. This was wonderful and inspiring and gave us so much to think about. So thank you to Mr. Hotep and to Fly for setting this up. Like, just amazing. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. I appreciate it. And if I, if I'm, if I haven't worn out my welcome, I'm supposed to be doing a series of workshops, but I think Sarah and them will have deliberated. They want this very candid, frank guy back. But we will be able to kind of dig through some of these things later. I'm hoping that we're able to continue this. But I have to have this kind of disposition because of the sense of urgency that I feel for the work and have been engaged in the work for several years at various levels. As a classroom instructor, as an administrator, as an assistant vice chancellor at the district office. I've worked at all these various levels, and we have to have this sense of urgency. Nikawana, yes, indeed.
So Lasana, I hear myself starting to ask that question, and that's like probably not a practical way of putting it. Can you provide some guidance or even anecdotally your experience in starting these conversations and helping folks to disentangle their reaction from the reality, right? So we hear about unfair things. We need to talk about those things to make action happen, but we often get tangled in people's feelings, like they are responsible, that we're talking specifically about them. I feel like at times that, along with understanding what the problem is, right? Having a clear sense qualitatively of what the problem actually is just as big an issue. It keeps folks from speaking out because they don't want to be perceived poorly. And it keeps folks from calling people in because they assume that person can't be an ally. And so how do we sort of prick that bubble so we can start having these not just brave but courageous conversations, as you said?
Yes, what I found to work for me personally, and I can give you some examples of institutions I've worked with, is to find those groups of people who want to do this type of work, regardless of how small or how large, and then start the work, right? Find something that we can have impact on and have impact on it, right? So let's see, when I was, I'm not gonna give a Merritt College example, it was kind of wild there. Oh, I will give an example. Okay. I was at Merritt College and we were trying to figure out a myriad of particular challenges that we had, right? And one of the challenges was this. It's a very practical, bizarre thing. The vice president of student services kept recognizing that from time to time, pretty often, she would get phone calls from like the general public and asking them to patch her into something. And she was like, why is this happening? And so what we did is we all got together, and if you ever been to Merritt College, there's admissions and records on one side, financial aid on the other side, and there's a meeting room with a floor to ceiling window you can see out of. And what we did is we just sat in that office and we called the numbers. And we noticed that nobody was answering the phone. And that's why people would just go to the vice president, find the vice president on the internet, and they would just call. Right. So we had to figure this out. Right. And there was a variety of reasons why people gave why they weren't answering the phone. One phone was actually literally unplugged and had 25,000 voice messages on it. Right. But what we did was we called everybody in and we were like, we cannot have an office where during office hours, no one can have conversations. No one can get you on the phone. Right. And so then the A&R people told, well, this is our workload and us serving people at the counter is priority. And so we worked through this whole process, right? And then we talked to the financial aid folks and we worked through, and we sat down collectively, right, to remedy these particular issues. But we knew that we cannot continue the status quo where no one could get a live human being on the phone at our institution, right? But we had to work with and hear out those particular things. Those who were a little bit more resistant, they just had to figure out where they fit in. That's one example. In terms of when I was at Skyline College, what we did is we started with just a small little program, the Equity Training Series, small cohort. of folks. We made sure that we had representation from various aspects of the college, from various different positions in the college, and began this very intensive kind of work, with a cohort of 20 or so. But those cohort of 20 had such a quality experience, they went out and became basically evangelists for the program, right? Until the program, by the time we got to our 6th cohort, we had almost 200 and some odd people throughout the institution who have gone through this intensive experience and were prepared to do the work. But we didn't say we had to start out with the 200 to 300 people. We were fine with starting out with the 15 to 20, right? And then we began to set the we were setting the thermostat, because out of that group came a math faculty member and a chemistry faculty member who were ended up working collaboratively, and they created a community of practice. And out of that community of practice, they began to think about how could they do their mathematics and their chemistry in a more equity-minded way. It began to create modules for other chemistry and math faculty. You start with what you have, with who you have, and those who may be caught in their feelings or who may be outliers, that's fine. They may come on at another iteration or in another phase, but we have to start the work, demonstrate the viability of it, and then share it with our colleagues and invite them in. A lot of folks don't want to join on something new because they're like, I don't know if it's going to work. So we have to demonstrate it. I see Rudy.
Thank you. I appreciate your time and sharing with everything you've been sharing. One thing I could say is, as far as with the math department, it wasn't by choice. There was a law as far as, having to change everything around. But I wanted to bring this to what you were talking about. How does what you're doing now look exactly the same as what you were doing before? And so, because sometimes it's easy to kind of filter things through it depends on the way you're looking at it, but that's a very cut and dry way of looking at it. It's a very simple way to evaluate. Are you doing something differently? Is what you're doing now exactly the same as what you were doing before? And so as far as as a department, we've done quite a bit. Because before there was, there was faculty that were like, okay, well, these classes are good because they filter out students, and which is going to what you were talking about earlier in the day. Whereas, so as a department, we've put a lot of work in, and it was a lot of work. But there's still work to do as far as individual faculty, right? I need to look at my own materials and my own approaches in my interactions with students and seeing, has it changed? Is it different? And that's a really easy way to look and to evaluate yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Gonzalez. It's a lot of ways to look at it. It's to look at those feedback forms that students fill out. It's also look at your course completion rates and disaggregate that data and see if you see any themes there, right? There's a myriad of ways that we can do, and I'm glad you're modeling this, is looking at our critical self-reflection, looking at our locus of control. And that's really what my main theme is in this